When I need to buy something, Craigslist is rarely my first choice, but occasionally you can find good deals on items that would otherwise be very expensive. At the time I was looking for new exercise equipment, and since weights and machines are very expensive to buy new, Craigslist was the ideal place to find used ones for a low price. Nevertheless, I browsed the site for several days past before I finally came across a posting that looked really nice. It was a set of weights for a pretty good price, and it had only been up for a few hours. The poster's name was Mary, so I emailed her to express my interest in her weight set and my desire to pick him up as soon as possible. Mary responded a short while later. She replied with her address, so of course I looked it up to see where it was and what the house looked like. She said she was available tonight when she got home from work at 7, which was a little late, but it wasn't a huge deal for me because I wanted them as soon as possible. The house was 20 minutes away, and it was in a small neighborhood that I was actually in. Familiar because one of my old friends used to live close by. The house was normal in size and had no distinguishing characteristics other than that it was quite old. However, nothing about it seemed odd or unsettling, so that evening I drove down there. The house was in a cul-de-sac at the end of the road, so I parked on the side of the house by their mailbox. I went up to the front door, which was already open, and knocked a few times to get someone's attention because I didn't want to just walk into the house. A moment later, a man who was supposed to meet with Mary to look at some exercise equipment she had put up on Craigslist came down the hall. His face brightened, and he said, "Come on in." He informed me that Mary would be downstairs in a few minutes while she was changing out of her work clothes, which undoubtedly made me wary, but he sounded sincere and credible, so I followed him into his living room, where there were some weights on the floor but no other furnishings or decorations at all. I believe the man noticed me glancing around, and he quickly explained that they were trying to sell the weights because they were moving out. I was still dubious, but after a moment I noticed that some plates were missing. I asked him if this was all there was to it because I thought I saw more in the photos. I asked him if he could go check on Mary to let her know I was here after he smiled again and said that Mary might know where the others are. He waited for a moment before agreeing and going up the stairs. I was clearly starting to worry that Mary might not even be a real person at this point, so I listened. After a few seconds of silence, I moved to the bottom of the stairs and looked up towards the top. The man was standing there, staring at the wall, likely waiting to make it appear as though he had actually gone to ask someone. I became terrified, realizing that. I started to hurry to the front door, hoping not to wake the man, but as soon as I turned around, I heard heavy footsteps rushing down the stairs. He called out for me to wait, and I ran straight out the front door and into my car. Oddly, as I drove away, the man ran out the front door and around the I didn't really know what the man's plan was, but I was certain that he was up to something, so after leaving the neighborhood, I pulled over on the side of the house and called the police to tell them what had happened so they could figure it out. The officers later stopped by my house and I gave them more details, and they informed me that the house where I had met him had been empty for more than a year, which naturally made me shiver. However, I was only able to describe the man's appearance, and other than that, all they could rely on were the weights he had placed in the vacant house, which may have fingerprints on them, which makes me concerned that he might still be out there luring people into deserted houses, but I'm also relieved that I managed to leave before he did whatever it was he intended to do. Story 2. I had recently graduated from college and needed a modest place to stay while I worked part-time at a small grocery store while I was looking for a new job, but now that I had graduated, it was time to start looking for a better job anyhow. Apartments were too expensive for me to rent alone, so I was primarily looking for places with extra rooms for rent. I knew it would be awkward, but I didn't have many options, to be honest. My former college roommate advised me to check Craigslist because, at the time, most other websites didn't allow you to post single rooms in a house, or perhaps it was just difficult to find them. Craigslist seemed to have a ton of options, so after a few days, I stuck with it. Began to become irritated because no one would respond to my requests, and those who did would simply say they were already taken. However, on Saturday morning, a new room appeared. It was reasonably priced and appeared to be quite nice. Tom, the advertiser, was marketing the property as a big house with a spare bedroom for rent that also had I thought that having a separate bathroom and closet would be ideal, so I sent him an email to express my interest before heading to work. Since I knew the listing had only been posted that morning, I was sure that I was the first to get in touch with him during my lunch break. I checked my emails, and Thomas responded, inviting me to come look at it that afternoon. We agreed on a time after work, and even though I knew I would be exhausted, I really wanted this place, so I drove there right away. It was only 10 minutes from the outside, and the house looked really nice. It honestly just looked like a typical medium-sized neighborhood house. I parked on the side of the road, approached the door, and then gently knocked after 30 seconds, then again with a little more force this time. A minute later, I took out my phone to text Tom, but before I could send the message, he opened the door and invited me in. I noticed right away that he was sweating profusely, as if he had just finished a long workout, and that he smelled terrible. To avoid being impolite or anything, I chose to ignore it. He started showing me the kitchen and living room on the ground floor, saying that he didn't use them frequently so I wouldn't have to worry about getting in his way. However, it appeared that he used them frequently because the couch was stained and the sink was full of old dishes. I didn't like how filthy the entire place was, and it was odd that the photos made the house appear to be very clean. One thing I remembered in particular was that the living room had a brown leather couch in the photo, but the real couch was black. I assumed Tom would use the old photos of the house. I was a little irritated by the dishonesty of it before it sold, but the only thing that mattered was that my room was upstairs. Tom led the way to the stairs, but he stopped when he got to the bottom of them and held out his hand as though he wanted me to go upstairs first. I felt strange and uneasy as I started up the stairs because Tom didn't. He stayed at the bottom and grinned, saying that my room would be the first one on the left. I followed him to the top and went a few steps into the hallway before hearing a soft thud behind the door to what was supposed to be my room. I turned to face Tom again, who had lost all of his smile. In an irritated tone, he responded that it was just one of his friends spending the night and that I shouldn't worry about it. He then encouraged me to see the room for myself because he was certain that I would like it. I was definitely quite anxious at this point, afraid even, and I wondered why he hadn't informed me that there was another person present. I tried to appear confident and started to descend the stairs as I explained that the place wasn't going to work out for me. He didn't seem to like that response, and he shifted his body to block most of the view. Something that I should know, everything started to add up, and all I wanted was to leave right away. He asked me to check out the bedroom again to see if I liked it, but I told him that I was not interested. He looked at me for a moment, and then, to my surprise, he smiled and said, "Okay," stepping aside. I stood a few steps away from the bottom of the stairs and firmly told him that I needed to leave. I'm not sure what was going on in that house, but something didn't feel right about it all. I felt fortunate to have been able to leave so quickly because I thought I might have to force my way out. A few hours later, I checked Craigslist, and the posting had been taken down. I'm still curious about who and what was in that. For all I know, the room upstairs might have been empty, but I have a feeling it was something much worse. Story 3. I spent a few years in a small house with a friend of mine, Nick, during my time in college. He was my roommate during my first year there, and after that, we decided to leave the dorms, and since we both had respectable jobs, we decided to split the rent on a house. Since this was our first time renting a place, we weren't sure how to properly budget, but after a few months, everything was fine. However, it wasn't until nearly a year later that we realized this place was draining both of our bank accounts, so the obvious solutions were to either move out or find another roommate because neither of us wanted to move out, so we began looking for a roommate. We first asked all of our other friends, but none of them were interested, so the only thing left to do was post online. Nick and I have never done this before. Nick posted on Craigslist and I posted on Facebook Marketplace. And it felt a little strange, but we knew we had little choice. A few weeks passed with only a few responses, none of whom were serious about moving in, until Nick showed me an email he received from a man named Sam in response to his Craigslist ad. The man appeared genuine, and the next day he came over to look at the house. I should note he was a couple years Sam was older than us and had recently graduated, but he seemed clean and pleasant, so we were happy to have him. He agreed to split the rent and moved in the following week. Over the next few months, Sam would spend a lot of time with us, and we actually got to know him fairly well, but then he suddenly became very closed off for some reason. Nick and I hardly ever saw the guy, and when we did, he would hardly speak. He would spend most of his time in his room with his door closed, only coming out to go to work or get food. I didn't mind, I just thought it was a little odd. In any case, it wasn't until about month 4 of his presence that things took a turn for the worse. I had just arrived home from work when Nick called my name softly from the living room. He explained that Sam was home, so I didn't want to talk too loudly, and then he told me about a strong odor he had noticed today while passing his room. I told him I hadn't noticed it. I got up and walked quietly down the hall towards Sam's door after he pointed to his room and told me to pass by quietly to see if I noticed. I didn't even need to get very close to smell what he was talking about. It was terrible and extremely disgusting, and I had no idea what it was and had never smelled it in the house before. I accepted Nick's suggestion that we ask him what it was, so we both went to his door while trying not to breathe in too deeply and knocked repeatedly while calling out to him. When he didn't answer, Nick claimed to be certain that Sam was inside, but after a few more minutes we gave up and decided to ask him tomorrow. We both made a quick dinner because it was getting late, watched TV in the living room while we ate, and then went to bed. The following day, I saw Sam leaving the house and asked him what the smell was. He replied that I had just taken out the trash, so he hurried off. That response didn't really make sense to me, but I didn't want to put too much pressure on him. I told Nick later that day, and he acknowledged that it was strange, but he was at a loss for what to do, so we decided to leave it at that. A few weeks passed, and Sam hardly spoke to us at all, but by this time, the smell had disappeared. I arrived home from work late one evening, and both Nick and Sam were likely already asleep in their rooms, so I went straight up to my room and dozed off as well. However, sometime during the night, I woke up and heard movement downstairs, which was Sam's room. I listened for a few minutes to try to understand what he was doing, but Sam left the house to go to work as usual the following morning, but he didn't come home that night. A few more days passed, and he still hadn't returned when I called him several times, but his phone immediately went to voicemail. We were beginning to worry, so we decided to check his room to see if there were hints about what was happening because his room was quite disorganized and it appeared that many of his belongings had been packed up and removed. I also discovered a pair of glasses in his drawer along with some other odd items, which was strange because Sam didn't wear glasses. He left some clothes and all of his items left, which led us to assume that he hadn't just moved out. Nick then called the police to report that Sam might have gone missing, and an officer showed up that evening to look into it and question us. We told him everything we knew and allowed him to view his room. Additionally, Nick gave him a photo of the two of us taken when Sam first moved in. We didn't hear back from another detective until a week later, when they told us that the man in the picture wasn't Sam but rather a family member who recognized them as their missing son. After a year or so, the case became much more complicated, and we had little useful information because the man lied about everything he told us. As a result, we lost contact and stopped receiving updates, and we were told that the man was just a normal guy living with his parents when he abruptly disappeared. Though I'm not sure if he was ever located, he never returned to our home for an unknown reason. It's undoubtedly the most intriguing and unsettling experience I've had, but the thought of sharing a home with someone who created a totally false identity and was legally missing gives me chills every time I consider it. Believe that this individual was attempting to conceal from the authorities due to something he had completed or was completing overseas.